Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about monopolies. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, most companies fired most of their employees in spite of having market monopoly and high profitability. Do you believe that the elites are waging a class warfare against the working class? If not, why? Well, I would say no. When big companies such as a Google or Microsoft or what have you, it doesn't have to be specifically IT companies, but we're in IT now, so we might as well stay there. Uh, it's usually not due to the fact that there's some nefarious reason for it, because that wouldn't make any sense. Why would you fire tons and tons of people in order to what, to spite them? Like you have to rehire people, which is a cost to the company and the bottom line and all these sorts of things, and that is usually the thing that drives everything, guys. So profitability and greed, and we'll call it whatever you want, uh, these are usually the factors that drive everything. And so one of the things that is I find a little bit interesting is this sentiment that is very prevalent in quite a lot of people. You see the same sort of thing with in wars, for example, when the Russian-Ukraine situation happened and so forth, or Vietnam and the US and so forth. There is this idea that, oh, it's a larger country and a smaller country in play here, therefore the outcomes are fairly obvious. But if you take a look at these sorts of situations, it's actually the case that the size of the size of the country matters a little bit less than the resources that are being put in, because the arena is still being fought in in the same way, regardless of who has the larger, like who is the larger economy and so forth. What it comes down to is the political connections and the people's willingness to fight and access to technology and things and so forth and so forth. It is not as clear cut as you are a big country or you are a small country, therefore the thing is already decided. It's the same thing with business. Just because the classic one is startups are much faster at moving, like developing projects and so forth and so forth. Therefore, it's a more engaging and fun environment to be in, whereas corporations are slower and safer. Well, that very much depends on how you look at it a little, and let me explain how I at least found these things to work most of the time. So when I'm talking about a large corporation, and the thing that I'm arguing for that people make as a mental mistake is the same thing with a large country. You assume that just because it's a large company, that means that its entirety is something to be considered when you work there as a software developer. But that is not true, because the scope, like even if you're part of a large organization, the scope of what you are doing is still basically the same in terms of, not I'm talking about what you do in your daily job, but rather like how much of an impact do you have? Do you think that you're working with the entire organization at one point at the same time? No, you work within a team, within a department, and so that's the thing that I'm trying to sell here, guys. That this idea that just because you're in a large corporation that means a bunch of stuff. Some of it, yes, is always going to be true, but remember, it's still usually the same amount of people you're dealing with. It's the thing that usually is slower with the larger corporations is like processes and things like that, because they basically have more scale to deal with. But at the local level, you cannot, as I said, it's almost like thinking like a country. You're not visiting an entire country at one point. You're visiting a segment of that country. You're when the people go to wars and so forth and so forth, you're not sending the entire country's population over to fight. You are sending a army, or like you have a set of resources. And the same thing is true for us here when we start working with larger corporations. So when you see cutbacks in a company that has, we're talking, it makes millions and billions and so forth. It's the same thing when you think about salaries and things like that. But just because you're dealing with a large company, you think that your salary is going to be like twice of what it would be somewhere else. That's not necessarily true, because at a company level, their bottom line might be really, really good. But at the local level, in a specific department, because guys, it's not about nets of the whole. It's not like one department can just sit there and spew away money, like piss away money by the billions. and never have any impact from that, because someone is their manager, someone is going to be responsible locally for how well they do, because companies that grow bigger and bigger, it's not like they just forget about trying to be efficient. Well, they try to be. We can make some puns about that for sure, but I hope that you understand that it's the same thing with a country. A country it has taxations at the local level, so the performance that you see at the highest level, which is like the scope of the entire company or the entire country or something like that, that might look really, really good. But in your specific department, things might look really, really bad. And companies want to maximize their profits. So you can get fired. That's why I'm telling people, like, just because you're in a big, gigantic corporation doesn't necessarily mean that you have job security. Because if you're in the wrong department that has been doing really poorly, or there's a product that you are maintaining that isn't really making any, it's not making anything happen, then you can get fired just as easily as if your startup fails or something similar to that. And so the same thing is true when you do work. If you are in the right department of a large corporation, you might learn or develop or have all these sorts of benefits that you wouldn't actually get from just joining a startup, for example. And this is that generalization thinking that we all do, everybody does it, there's no denying that that is happening, but it's a little bit dangerous when you don't have the ability to, at the very least, think a little bit deeper of some assumptions and be a little bit critical of this, well, the sentiments that go around, where if someone tells you something arbitrary, like, or dictators are bad, or there are bad people in this part of the world, or greedy people like the upper classes, like that, us them, thinking that that's always true, because what is it, John Cleese says, like, it's really nice to be an extremist because there's so many benefits, because you can make everybody who is on the other side of where you are the enemy and make them responsible for everything bad that goes on in the world. So what I want you to take away from this is that no, you can get fired, I promise you, regardless of if you're higher up level or so forth and so forth. It has nothing to do with class warfare usually. It has to do with plain old bottom lines. And the reason why people seem to have a hard time understanding these concepts is because, as I've said before, it's the us and them thinking. You think about another country as just a gigantic population of like-minded people who sort of share the same values, yet somehow if you talk to them, every single one of them kind of goes, yeah, things are not always as great as all that and so forth. Like, there's a range of people, and like, it's just a collective. You abstract things to the point where you simplify everything to the point where you can make generalizations, and sometimes you have to be able to do that, and sometimes it's better to think a little bit harder about it. And so if you think about it a little bit harder, I hope that you can understand that a giant corporation is no, in terms of like how many people that you interact with, is not that different from a startup. It's just the organization and the processes around that just keeps on growing. And the startup is going to happen, it's exactly the same thing is going to happen to the startup. If a startup starts growing, you get the same sort of issues as you have in already a larger corporation. And the thing is, guys, just because the whole organization might be super rich or like do really well, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're in the department that is making all of that happen. And that's the thing that dictates everything. Your manager has a manager who needs to check their costs, and then there's a boss there who checks their costs, and then it just goes up until you reach the top of the pyramid. And if your segment of that pyramid isn't doing so well, you can get laid off. It is completely possible, and it's usually not because they're trying to stick it to you. They're trying to make money. Have a great day.